My husband's ex told him I cheated on him with my stepbrother, claimed our baby wasn't his. We ended up divorcing. Years later, he comes back and wants the baby, but he never expects the bad news. My husband's ex led him to believe that I was pregnant with my stepbrother's baby, so he asked me for a divorce or an abortion. But after 10 years, he wants to see his child, and I have some bad news for him. My husband's ex completely manipulated him into believing that I was cheating on him, but it gets much worse. She convinced him that the person I was cheating on him with was my stepbrother, and that I was pregnant with his child. I would never be unfaithful to him, let alone my stepbrother. He didn't believe me, so I left him in the end. But now he wants to see his baby, for his reference and also for me, because I'm not going to use any real names here, and want to keep the fake names I have chosen. The people involved in this story are myself, 35 years old, Grant 38, my current husband Sebastian, my stepbrother Ezra, my ex-wife Cassie in her 30s. I don't know her exact age. Ezra's ex-wife before we met. I'm trying to be as clear as possible, but this is a mixture of seeking advice with fear and venting anger that I don't want to take out on anyone else. So even if you're just here to read about the horrible lives of strangers and don't want to leave any advice, feel free to read. I hope I can do justice to the summary, one of the worst periods of my life. Before I get to with background information, here is a summary of the current situation. I have just found out that my ex-husband has asked for me after almost a decade of silence because he wants to see me and my child. It may not seem like a big deal when written in one sentence, but I hope as you read on, you'll understand why this news has caused such an emotional upheaval. When I was 24 years old, my best friend and I moved across the country to a new town and a new state to start our adult lives. 6 months later, she was offered her dream job in our hometown, and of course I encouraged her to take it. Unfortunately, that meant I was left alone in a new city and a new state. I met Ezra 2 weeks after she left. I was alone with no friends and stressed about my new job. He had just broken up with his high school girlfriend, and all of that combined to create a very intense relationship. A few weeks after we met, he practically lived in my flat, and I was convinced that he was the love of my life. He was in his last semester of college after changing his major several times and was ready to work in his father's engineering company, half an hour from the city. Maybe I was starting to see a future in this city. Looking back now, the cracks were there from the start. Hindsight is much clearer than foresight. When his graduation came and his ex-girlfriend showed up with his mother, I just smiled, introduced myself, and tried to make a good impression on his family. Cassie was practically a friend of the family, which was to be expected considering how long they had been together before they split up. But she was basically a classic girl next door. Their mothers were best friends, so they grew up together, and I was told that the day they started dating was the best day of Ezra's mother's life. Still, I was young, naive and in love, so I took it. I sat next to her and did everything I could to get along with his mother. She never fully accepted me, but I never stopped trying. Cassie became a constant in my life. From that moment on, Ezra told me that it was hard for him to break off contact with her, because their families were so close. So I tried to understand. Didn't matter that she clung to his arm at every event or called him by every affectionate nickname in the book. We'd come home to our flat, because it was quickly becoming our home, and he'd tell me he loved me and I'd believe him. He just didn't want to hurt his family by cutting Cassie out. I mean, how could I complain when I love my own family with all my heart? I would do anything for them, so I could understand that. He wanted to protect his mother's feelings. 8 months into our relationship, he asked me to marry him. I know now that he did it on the same day he found out Cassie had a new boyfriend. But at the time, I was blinded by love and happily accepted. Even though there was no ring, I thought he wanted to propose so badly that he couldn't wait to get one. 1 year later, I walked down the aisle happy to marry him. At the time, I thought my wedding to Ezra was going to be the best day of my life. I hadn't seen my family for months, and suddenly they were all in the same room, celebrating my husband and me. I was so excited to meet them and introduce them. Up to that point, the only member of my family Ezra had met was my stepbrother, who had visited me a few months before. I didn't even care that Cassie showed up in a white dress or danced with him almost as much as I did. Afterwards, I apologized, thinking that Ezra was simply celebrating this special day with his lifelong friend. After all, I had danced with my best friend and my stepbrother, the two people closest to me other than Ezra. That's what I'd done throughout my marriage to him. I ignored the warning signs and justified his actions, especially when it came to Cassie. But that should have been a huge red flag. For 2 years, I made excuses every time Ezra prioritized his ex-girlfriend, who he privately called obsessive and crazy, among other insults when no one else could hear. I ignored every time his mother compared me to Cassie. I turned the other cheek every time Cassie made a snide remark disguised as a joke or helpful advice. At the end of the day, Ezra was all I had. Right. All the friendships I had made in this town were through him or us as a couple, and any family connection I had was through him. My family lived hours away in another state, and Ezra was never willing to make that trip. He was all I had. Then I got pregnant. To be clear, there was no abuse or anything like that. In a way, that would have been easier to explain to my family and friends. What finally made me open my eyes and realized how much Cassie had influenced his life was the fact that he truly believed that I was pregnant with my stepbrother's child. Take a moment to process how absurd that is. Ezra actually thought that the baby I was carrying wasn't his, but that I had cheated on him with Sebastian, my stepbrother, because I was living in another city far away from home, and our relationship hadn't been that long before we got married. Sebastian and Ezra had only met once before the wedding, when Sebastian came to visit me early in the relationship. The second time they met was at our wedding. A year and a half after our wedding, I flew back to my hometown to celebrate my mother's 60th birthday. Ezra didn't want to join me on the trip. 1 month later, I found out I was pregnant. I thought Ezra would be happy. He had always talked about wanting a big family with lots of kids, and we had friends and family who were ready to support us. But instead of being happy, the first thing he said was, "She said this would happen." It's been almost 10 years, and I still remember it with absolute clarity. I was completely confused. The only explanation he gave me was, she had warned me and I should have believed her. Instead of being happy, he left the apartment that same night and didn't answer any of my calls or messages. When he came back the next morning, he gave me 2 options, abort or a divorce. To spare you the details, when I finally managed to get him to explain what had happened, turned out that Cassie had filled his head with lies. Apparently during our wedding, she had convinced him that Sebastian and I had behaved inappropriately for step-siblings, that we were too close, too affectionate. According to her, the way we hugged, the way we posed for family photos, and the way we spent time together at the reception were too intimate, almost romantic. She even told him that I had probably moved to our town because I was heartbroken after Sebastian got a girlfriend. After our wedding, Cassie spent months filling Ezra's head with lies about Sebastian and me. All she had were little fragments of our relationship that she saw on social media, because Sebastian lived in another state. But that didn't stop her. When I traveled alone to see him and came back pregnant, That was all it took to convince her. Ezra, I was having an affair. Of course I denied everything. None of the accusations Ezra believed because of Cassie were true. Sebastian was like a twin brother to me. The accusation was not only absurd but deeply insulting. But Ezra didn't care. He didn't care when I offered to take a paternity test. He didn't care when I showed him medical records, showing that I had been pregnant before I traveled. He didn't even care when I broke down in front of him. I begged him to come to his senses. It was a hard blow, but I couldn't ignore it. I packed my bags, asked for a transfer at work, and returned home to my real family. All in all, the divorce was relatively easy. Ezra's mother had insisted on a prenuptial agreement, and the lack of community property made the process quick. Ezra also refused to take a paternity test, signed a document relinquishing all rights to our unborn child. I hadn't heard from him since, and now I find out that he's looking for me and our son. My concerns are as follows. My current husband, Grant, knows very little about Ezra or how my previous relationship ended. He knows that I was married and that it didn't end well. But that's it. It's only a matter of time. Ezra will find a way to contact me. What am I supposed to do when that happens? Maybe it's not as bad as I think it is. And if it is, don't hesitate to tell me. But I'm starting to panic a bit. This is a chapter of my life that I thought was completely closed, and I don't want to reopen it with the intention of not attracting more attention than I already have. I'll try to be even more vague with the details of this situation and all the people involved. Perhaps the word stalker is an exaggeration, considering what has happened so far, which I admit hasn't been much. 2 days after an old friend warned me that my ex-husband was trying to contact me, I received follow requests on all of my social media accounts, even though he hasn't sent me any messages yet, because I haven't accepted any requests. I'm afraid it won't be long before they arrive. He's even looked at my LinkedIn profile, which I can see, because the platform shows who has visited your profile. It's clear that he's been looking for me on purpose. I gathered my strength and spoke to my husband, Grant, about everything I mentioned in my previous post. I told him the whole story of my relationship with Ezra, about Cassie, about everything I had endured from him and his family, and finally about his reaction to my pregnancy. Thankfully, the man I am married to today is 1,000 times better than my ex was, understanding and gave me all his support as I told this never-ending story. When I finished, he was more concerned about in finding a way to comfort me than that I had never told him this before. Of course he did. It was at that moment that the desire to follow intensified. We discussed what to do and decided to block all his accounts on every platform where he could find me, which was basically all of them. He had stalked every corner of my online life. Luckily, all my accounts are private. I thought that blocking him would give me some peace of mind, but then the messages started. He was creating fake accounts to send me private messages on almost every platform. In them he said he had made a mistake, that he wanted to see me and meet his son. All the messages were different, but they all ended up saying the same thing. He wouldn't stop contacting me until I let him see his son. He insisted that the child deserved to know his real father, and that it was better to have a biological father than having a stepfather. He claimed I couldn't understand because, according to him, I had always thought that relationships with in-laws were the same as blood relations. The more I ignored him, the longer his messages became. He insisted that he had the right to see his son. He wrote that he was new accounts and that I couldn't block him forever. I have no doubt that he will continue trying to contact me. I just hope that sending longer messages is the only way. He is escalating this situation. Grant has assured me that we are perfectly safe, and that Ezra won't do anything really dangerous. But I have a bad feeling about all this. He turned up at my mom's house My ex-husband, who I hadn't seen in almost 10 years, turned up at my mom's door. Because I didn't answer his messages. I visit my mom every Saturday without fail. Unless something important comes up. I always take my son with me. But since Friday night, he had spent the night at a friend's house. This time I went alone. In the morning, I didn't notice the car parked across the street, or the man in the driver's seat. At least not until I parked in the driveway and got out of the car. When he also got out of his car and walked towards me, understandably I was shocked and frightened when I saw a man standing next to me. But when I recognized him, the fear didn't go away. He was standing outside my mother's house, a place he had never visited during our marriage, a place he never bothered to go. "What are you doing here?" It was the same as in his messages. He wanted to see his son. He had followed me across the country, apparently finding the address through shipping records, when I moved just because he wanted to see his son, the same child he once believed wasn't his. I don't know if I was being stupid or brave, but in that moment, the fear left me and I was overcome with rage. I didn't care that he had found my mother's address. I didn't care that we were in the middle of a neighborhood, known for its nosy neighbors. And I didn't care that I was alone with him. For the first time since our marriage had ended, I shouted at him with everything I had in me. I accused him of every single thing he had done during our relationship. In his face, his only defense was that Cassie had manipulated him. He told me that he was hurt and that he believed his lifelong friend. Apparently it all started when Cassie almost got married a few months ago and finally confessed to him that she had been lying all along. The moment Ezra found out that I was pregnant with his child, he started looking for me. Thankfully, none of our mutual friends would give him my number, so he resorted to finding me online. And when I blocked him everywhere, he had no choice but to find me in person. He said he was desperate to see his child, but I had bad news for him. He didn't have a child. The stress of his accusations, the divorce and the move across the country were piling up. And just a few months after we separated, I lost the baby. The child he had given up on was never born. Ezra didn't have a child. My son Spencer is grandson, my stepson who I adopted as my own. He has the same red hair as me, and an equally intense personality. Ezra was right about one thing. For me, relationships with in-laws are just as valuable as blood relations. I have a child, but Ezra doesn't. This point, I had screamed so loudly and for so long that my mother and stepfather came out of the house, along with some curious neighbors. I don't know if it was the audience or the shock, but when my stepfather told Ezra that it was best for him to leave, he left without arguing. Maybe I should have told him all this from the start, instead of blocking him and ignoring his messages. But how could I have known he would turn up here? I just hope that now he knows the truth, he'll go back to his life, away from me and my family. Logical. I should have realized it wouldn't be so. To get rid of Ezra. Not after he followed me across the country, desperate to see a child that doesn't exist. To be honest, when I called him a stalker in the previous updates, part of me was joking, trying to feel better about his sudden reappearance in my life. Yes, he had been following my every move on social media, where I had an account, but there's a big difference between being a passive observer and becoming an active stalker. Apparently, Ezra was more than willing to make that leap. I don't know why I thought he'd believe me when I told him that Spencer wasn't his son. To be clear, he isn't. Spencer doesn't even have a biological connection to me beyond my marriage to his father and my adoption of him. We don't share blood. The coincidence that we both have the same red hair was something Grant and I called destiny. When I decided to adopt Spencer as my own, though, expecting Ezra to believe me, when the main reason for our divorce was precisely that, he refused to believe me. was foolish on my part. Honestly, I don't know what I expected him to do. Maybe I thought he would just accept what I told him and disappear forever, that I'd never have to see him again. After that day at my mom's house, I began to notice his car everywhere. At first I thought it was parked near my street, but it was only for a moment, so I thought I was being paranoid. The second time I thought I saw his car. I mentioned it to Grant. From then on, we both started to be more vigilant, and sure enough, his car kept showing up. Each time we noticed it, he would drive off before we could do anything. After 2 weeks of this, we decided to go to the police. We had taken some photographs of his car in various places, mostly near my mom's house and ours. I thought the police would take the fact that we were being watched and followed by my ex-husband, who was convinced that my child was his. Surely they would do something? Apparently not. Even though what we presented might seem suspicious, the police told us they couldn't arrest someone just for being around us. We had no evidence that he intended to harm us, and he hadn't done anything directly against us, so we're on our own. Update 4. I'm happy to report that my ex-husband will no longer be a problem for me or my family after we did everything we could to convince the police to take preventative action. Without success, we finally managed to get the necessary evidence for his arrest. As I mentioned in my last update, Ezra had been hanging around Spencer's school. The conclusion was clear. He wanted to take the child he thought was his, no matter what I wanted. Obviously, neither Grant nor I were going to let that happen. Luckily, our neighbor, who was a teacher at Spencer's school, shared our concern. She was. Thanks to her, we were able to stay ahead of things. We knew that Ezra would try something eventually. We just had to wait. In the meantime, we informed the school staff of what was happening. We made it clear to everyone in the office that Spencer was not to leave the school with anyone except our neighbor, Grant or me. 16:53, and a few days later, it happened. In the middle of the day, Ezra came into the school office and said he was there to pick up Spencer for me because there had been an emergency with his grandmother. He even mentioned my mom's name. I guess he thought that would make him more credible. When the staff told him they needed to call me before releasing Spencer to him, he insisted that I was busy with the emergency and couldn't be disturbed. When he couldn't convince them, he pretended to call me himself and left the building with that excuse. Of course he did. He never called. Instead, he sat in his car outside the school. But I waited. The school called me immediately to inform me of everything that had happened, just as we had planned. They also videotaped the whole interaction. At the end of the school day, they dismissed the students as usual, but they kept Spencer in his classroom with my neighbor. It was then that the police arrived, video in hand, to arrest Ezra while he was in his car. Inside the car, the police found 2 plane tickets to his home state, along with powerful sedatives. They believe his plan was to use the drugs on Spencer and take him away. Ezra was arrested and remains in custody until his trial, where he will be charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, endangering a minor, and any other charges they may add. Finally, our nightmare is over. Update 5. It's been months since my last update. Ezra is in prison. I'm not going to go into all the exact charges against him because I don't want anyone to be able to find out his real name and trace me through it. But I can say that he will be in prison for several years, although I would prefer him to stay there forever. The charges include the ones I mentioned in the previous post, along with a few others. Somehow he got away with some of the charges, which makes no sense to me, but as long as he's behind bars, I don't care. He tried to justify the tranquilizers by saying they were his, which was true because he had a prescription for them. He had taken them after finding out the truth. Still, the plane tickets and the whole plan were so that he might have thought of using them. On top of that, we now have restraining orders against him for Grant, Spencer and me. He will never be able to go near Spencer's school without being arrested. During the trial, an official paternity test was carried out which proved once and for all, that Spencer is Grant's son. My medical records were also produced with my consent, confirming that I had suffered a miscarriage. A few months after my separation from Ezra, all those years ago, Ezra did all this to end up in prison for absolutely nothing. And you know what the icing on the cake is? Cassie. She turned up at the trial and made a big scene, pretending to be devastated because Ezra was going to jail just after her husband had publicly left her. Apparently, she had been constantly posting on social media and supporting him. In her last post, her husband commented that she was free to support him in prison, as she refused to stop talking about him. Some friends from the have told me that their divorce is already in progress. Of course, I've blocked Cassie and all of Ezra's acquaintances on every platform I could think of. I've cut off any possibility of meeting them again. Cassie and Ezra were together, which many people in the comments have guessed. And I won't deny that I did too. That's why she almost got divorced. I don't know if their relationship started while Ezra and I were married, before we got married, or after we separated. But what's clear is that she always wanted to go back to him. The good news for her is that she'll now be able to enjoy conjugal visits in prison and won't have to hide from her husband while she does her thing with Ezra. Obviously, it won't be as glamorous as doing it in a fancy hotel. But then, not everything in life is perfect, right? The funniest part is that I found out about all this because Cassie contacted me by email. Yes, she had the audacity to send me a message. It was full of insults and hurtful comments, as you can imagine. Basically, she was trying to rub it in my face that she had one, because in the end, thanks to the lies she put in Ezra's head, she ended up with him. I was very tempted to respond and tell her she shouldn't be so proud, because all she got was a pathetic loser. But the truth is, I wanted to be the more mature person in the situation. That's a lie I told her. And of course, after I sent her my reply, I blocked her. I imagine she must have sent more emails full of inappropriate things. But luckily for me, no one will read them. What a tragedy, right? Anyway, even though I could have taken the high road, in the end I couldn't resist having the last word. Sometimes being a bit immature is the best therapy. Update 7. I have just found out something, which I'm sure will leave you all speechless. And I couldn't wait to get home to write about it. Ezra was beaten up in prison. Don't worry. If any of you feel sorry for this gentle soul, he's out of danger. But from what I've been told in prison, they don't look kindly on men who try to kidnap children. So he was given a special welcome to make it clear what they think of someone like him. No matter how much Ezra has tried to play the victim all this time, the rules in prison are very different. There, his attempts at manipulation and his superior attitude mean nothing, and he seems to have learnt that the hard way.